Hello and welcome to The Globe on SABC News. I'm Lulu Gabu. Thank you for joining us. On to our top story. Protesters have gathered in a French town close to the coastal resort of Biarritz, the venue of the G7 summit. Demonstrators holding placards are at the town of Hendaye to protest against economic and climate policies pursued by the world's leading industrial nations and to promote alternatives.
Anti-globalization and climate activists teamed up with Yellow Vest protesters and Basque nationalists on Saturday to protest against the G7 meeting in the southwest coastal town of Biarritz. They said world leaders don't do what they say and that the rich-poor divide is growing due to the lack of action from them.
Today we are talking first and foremost to the population and the public to tell them that there is hope, that we don't have to suffer. These ultra-liberal, security-focused, repressive and racist policies of these 7 heads of state.
Meanwhile, world leaders have started to arrive for the summit. Among them, US President Donald Trump, who touched down to an icy reception from his G7 allies. In a bilateral meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, Trump said he expected a G7 summit in France this weekend to accomplish a lot.
We actually have a lot in common, Emmanuel and I. We've been friends for a long time, and every once in a while we go at it just a little bit, not very much, but we get along very well. We have a very good relationship, sort of, I think I could say, a special relationship. We all remember the Eiffel Tower dinner, and that was a very good beginning, and we have some really great things to talk about, and we couldn't ask for better weather or a more beautiful location. And next year we'll be hosting in the United States, so that'll be very, very good. That'll be great. We're going to do a good job. But so far, so good. The weather is perfect. The guest is fantastic. Everybody's getting along, and I think we'll accomplish a lot this weekend, and I look forward to it. And thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Summit host Emmanuel Macron wants the heads of Britain, Canada, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United States to focus on the defense of democracy, gender equality, education and the environment, and has invited Asian, African and Latin American leaders to join them for a global push on these issues.
And we've asked Jonathan Poitras, Professor of Economics and Public Policy from King's College London, to give us some insights into the unfolding G7 summit. Prof, good evening and thank you so much for joining us this evening on The Globe.
Good evening.
Now, world powers are already trading barbs on the Iran nuclear deal. Is this not likely to overshadow the summit?
Well, actually, I think there are probably worse problems facing world leaders in the summit than the Iran nuclear deal, quite frankly. The Iran nuclear deal has been a long-running sore between the US, Iran, and of course the European powers who signed off on it and are not happy that Donald Trump unilaterally abrogated it. But it's not immediately going to lead to a crisis. We are already, however, in a crisis because of the US-China trade war, which, of course, has, and of course, there are also severe trade tensions between the US and the European G7 members, in particular France. So while the tension between the US and Iran is something that's been going on for half a century and is obviously a concern, what we're really facing here is the potential disintegration of the world economic order, the liberal world economic order that has essentially formed the framework for global economic relations over really the last 40 years. Between them, President Trump and to some extent the Chinese are really pushing that to the verge of destruction. And that, it seems to me, is the crisis that's really facing us.
Now, critics are calling on the G7 to get serious about tackling the gap between the haves and the have-nots. What's your view about the way the G7 is going about in tackling this wealth gap?
Well, the G7 is really not focusing on that at all, I think it's fair to say. Donald Trump is very clearly focusing on the what is becoming a steadily more confrontational relationship with China. You know, that is what is dominating the world's geopolitics at the moment. That is what will dominate the G7, is the fact that this economic relationship, the relationship between the US and China, which one way or another has been broadly beneficial to the global economy over the last 30 years and has indeed lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. And of course, world trade and the expansion of global trade has also helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in India and elsewhere in the developing world. That is now under threat because of a combination of long-term political and economic forces which have raised the rise of China, which I think were to some extent inevitable, but also due clearly to President Trump's increasingly, frankly, erratic and confrontational behavior. I think, we've become slightly used to it, but it's absolutely extraordinary that a day or two ago, President Trump tweeted, "Who is the biggest enemy for the US? Jerome Powell, who of course is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man that President Trump himself appointed, or President Xi of China, perhaps the second most important person on the planet, and while there are conflicts, not someone who you would want to gratuitously insult." The idea of a president of the United States behaving in a way which is not only confrontational, but frankly verging on disturbed, I think many Washington analysts are saying, is something that really the world ought to be very, very worried about indeed.
I guess the fact that Chinese President Xi Jinping is not attending could be, in reaction to different things that are taking place, or the tensions that are taking place or escalating. What should the world read into the fact that the Chinese president did not show up?
Well, the G7, of course, is not, China is not a member of the G7. And the fact that the G7 is essentially the West plus Japan is one reason why it became steadily less effective over the last 2 decades, and one reason why we moved towards having a G20, where China and India and indeed South Africa were able to attend and represent the interests of emerging market economies. So that in itself is not a surprise. But what I think we have seen is that China is not taking President Trump's latest insults lying down. It's described both his words and his actions as unacceptable. And it's really this relationship, which, as I said, has always had inevitably its tensions over the last 30 years, but has been very important to the development of the world economy. This relationship is really under very, very severe strain. We're not exactly at war yet, but we're certainly in a trade war, and it's quite possible we will move towards a wider economic war. Remember, President also called on American companies in a very threatening way to stop trading with China, stop doing business with China, bring jobs back home to the US. And that really is not the sort of language that the Chinese are accustomed to hearing.
Now, just continuing with the issue of the trade war between China and the US and the effects of this on poorer nations, can it get any worse? So, considering the fact that the rich nations can't really focus on what is really needed in the world, especially with the poorer economies?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, this is both a distraction and damaging. And if the result of a trade war is a global recession, and I think many economists think that is not just possible, but moving towards being probable, that will hurt all countries, and it will certainly hurt developing countries. I think it will also mean that it is very difficult to get action on some of the issues which most concern developing countries. So, for example, climate change, where there is both a long-term crisis, of course, about how to respond to climate change, and then, of course, there's a short-term issue with how to respond to the very widespread fires in the Amazon jungle at the moment. The idea that the G7 is going to be able to put on a unified front and come up with concrete actions to address any of these issues, I think is pretty unlikely at the moment.
Now, let's look at the summit which is taking place parallel with the UK working on its divorce from the European Union. Does the UK hold any strong position to shape ideas at the summit? And is there any country really not willing to see eye to eye with Boris Johnson? Well,
Boris Johnson has clearly developed quite a close relationship with President Trump. Whether that is terribly useful to the UK at the moment is unclear, but he has certainly established a rapport, and to some extent, not completely, they do share some ideological predispositions in common. But frankly, the UK, the result of Brexit, or the Brexit debate within the UK, is that we really have become very much internally focused. I think gone are the days when leaders like Margaret Thatcher or more recently Gordon Brown went to these sorts of events and were able to put their own stamp on the agenda and shape the direction of world affairs. At the moment, the UK is really, frankly, completely obsessed with itself, and in particular with Brexit, and really isn't in a position to exert much broader influence. And I don't think most of the leaders there will be paying that much attention to what Boris Johnson says about world affairs.
Now, can this meeting, relaunch multilateralism, promote democracy and tame globalization to ensure it works for everyone?
Well, I think that is highly improbable. It was always a difficult task to do all of those things. But some previous leaders, when we had the likes of President Obama, the likes of Gordon Brown, then I think, although it was always very difficult, and although these summits, frankly, there's always a lot more talk than actual delivery or concrete action. That's always been true, and that won't change. But I think there were some meaningful moves in the 2000s. That's really behind us, I think. This summit will be dominated by tensions and conflict. The specter of a trade war between US and China, even though China is not represented, increasing tensions, both economic and geopolitical, between the US and the EU, and then Brexit. And frankly, if the result of the summit is simply not to have any massive arguments or massive further deterioration in those relations, then I suspect that the civil servants and diplomats who've been doing the preparatory work, frankly, will be quite satisfied with that, with the fact that it doesn't make anything worse, as opposed to hoping for it to make much things better. I'm sorry to be so downbeat, but the prospect of getting any serious international coordinated action on the important issues like climate change, poverty, development, I think that is pretty distant given the cast of characters who are going to be at this summit.
Now, can we safely say that this G7 summit is mostly about Donald Trump and the actions that he's taken and decisions that he's made in the past with regards to we touched on the China trade war, the trade tensions, and issues generally focused on Donald Trump and the US?
Mostly, yes. I mean, the primary objective of the other 6 leaders at the G7 will be to get Donald Trump to dial down the rhetoric about China, to, if possible, moderate the use of tariffs, to try and step back from that trade war. That is what they will be most focused on. I think they're unlikely to achieve very much, but they will be most focused on that. Beyond that, climate change has clearly risen up the agenda again, and there will be an attempt, at least, I think, to try and come up with some sort of show of unity, in particular on trying to put both pressure and incentives on Brazil to do something about the fires in the Amazon jungle. Whether that will actually have any practical impact on the ground in the Amazon, I think is fairly unlikely, but I think they'll try at least to come up with a form of words. But as you say, I think the primary objective very much is damage limitation, and it's about Donald Trump. It's about trying to stop Donald Trump both driving the global economy off the cliff in the short term and also, more broadly, further eroding the international economic order of the last 30 or 40 years.
Professor Portes, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That is Jonathan Portes. He is a professor of economics and public policy from King's College London. He was joining us via Skype. In other news,